The first time a captured German soldier sat down to a meal in a Midwestern farmhouse, he froze. The table was set with steaming bread, a slab of butter, a bowl of mashed potatoes, and, most strangely, slices of meat so thick they looked unreal. He later confessed, "I thought it was a trick, that they wanted to fatten us, to mock us, before something worse came." But nothing worse came. He was told to eat. And when he did, he tasted something that made him weep, not because of hunger, but because he realized America was not the hell his commanders had described. Some German prisoners of war didn't want to go home when the war was over. And the reasons why go far beyond food. To understand this strange chapter of history, we need to step back. Between 1942 and 1946, nearly 425,000 German POWs were held in the United States. They were spread out across the country, housed in more than 700 camps from Texas to Wisconsin, from Alabama to California. At first, many Americans didn't even know they were there. The U.S. government kept their arrival low profile, fearing backlash. After all, young American men were dying overseas. How would their families react if they saw German prisoners walking freely under the sun of a Kansas wheat field? But the truth was, the U.S. faced a problem. The war had created massive labor shortages in farming and industry. Millions of American men were drafted. Fields went untended. Factories strained. And so the War Department made a choice. German POWs would work. And that decision, putting the enemy to work in America's heartland, set the stage for countless encounters that would forever alter the lives of both prisoners and civilians. Let's rewind to the mindset of the average German soldier arriving on U.S. soil. From Nazi propaganda, he had been told America was a land of chaos. A mongrel nation torn apart by crime, ruled by greedy Jews, weak leaders, and decadent culture. In some cases, soldiers had been promised they would be tortured if captured by the Allies, especially by Americans. The shock then began the moment they arrived. POWs who disembarked from trains in the U.S. were stunned by what they saw. American cities had neon lights, cars humming in every direction, and grocery stores overflowing with food, even while the war still raged. Compared to the bombed-out ruins of Hamburg or Cologne, the contrast was staggering. Letters and testimonies survived describing their first impressions. It was like stepping into another world. Our cities were rubble. Here there was music playing from radios, families walking with ice cream cones, and no bombs overhead. One German officer admitted privately, "I began to wonder if everything we had been told was lies." Camps varied, of course. Some were harsh, especially the early ones. But under the Geneva Convention, the U.S. was obligated to treat prisoners humanely. And by and large, they did. Camps were organized with barracks, mess halls, recreation areas, even theaters and libraries. Prisoners were allowed to form orchestras, stage plays, and publish newsletters. They had medical care. They had Red Cross parcels. Most importantly, they had food. A German POW in Texas wrote, "We ate better than our families at home. Bread, meat, milk, eggs. Sometimes I could not finish what was given to me. I felt shame knowing my mother stood in line for hours in Germany just for a piece of bread." Of course, not every guard was friendly, and not every day was easy. There were fights, escapes, punishments. But overall, the German POW experience in America was so surprisingly humane that many prisoners came to see the U.S. in a new light. The key turning point, though, was work. Because America needed labor, German prisoners were often sent to nearby farms and factories. Under guard, they harvested crops, repaired fences, chopped wood, or processed food. And here is where something remarkable happened: contact. Farmers and their families interacted daily with these young men who, only months before, had been shooting at Americans overseas. Many were just 18, 19, 20 years old. And as work went on, something melted. A Kansas farmer's wife remembered. "At first, I was afraid. But when I saw one of the boys stumble in the field, just a skinny child with blister hands, I thought, this is no monster. This is just someone's son." Prisoners, too, were stunned by the kindness shown to them. Some were invited into homes for meals. Others were given small gifts or allowed to write letters with American stationery. One POW recalled, "The farmer's wife brought us lemonade. Cold lemonade on a hot day. I had never tasted such a thing. For a moment, I forgot I was a prisoner." It was in these little moments, the clink of glasses on a porch, the passing of bread across a table, that the enemy became human. Meanwhile, back in Germany, things were very different. Cities lay in ruins. Food was scarce. Civilians struggled to survive amid rationing, air raids, and the creeping reality of defeat. When German POWs received letters from home, they often found themselves torn in two directions: guilt and disbelief. Guilt because they were eating full meals while their families starved. Disbelief because the letters confirmed what they now suspected: Germany had been lying to them. One POW wrote in his diary, "My sister writes that they eat turnip soup 3 times a day. Turnip soup. Here today I had pork and apple pie. How can this be war? How can I explain this when I return?" This contrast became unbearable for some. Returning to Germany no longer seemed like going home. It felt like stepping back into a nightmare. Not all POWs changed their views. Some remained fiercely loyal to Hitler and the Reich until the very end. Camps sometimes saw clashes between hardliners and those who began to sympathize with America. But for thousands, a seed was planted. The seed was not love for America, exactly, but a realization. Life could be different. People could live without constant fear, without ration lines, without bombers overhead. Even prisoners could experience dignity. Some began to dream, not of returning to Germany, but of staying in America forever. A soldier from Bavaria wrote, "When the war ends, they will send us back. But I do not want to go back. I want to start here with clean soil, with no lies. Perhaps it is impossible, but still I dream." There's a story told about a group of POWs in Nebraska who were working the fields in late summer. The harvest was done, and the farmer's family invited them to a barbecue. The men sat on wooden benches, smelling the smoke of grilling meat, hearing the chatter of children playing tag in the grass. The farmer carved thick slices of beef and passed them around. Someone poured beer into tin cups. The POWs ate in silence at first, awkward, unsure. Then one of them began to hum a song. Another joined in. Soon the whole group was singing, softly at first, then louder, until even the farmer and his wife clapped along. For a brief evening, the war was gone. There were no prisoners and no guards. Only people, sharing food under a wide American sky. One POW later remembered, "That night, I felt freer than I ever had in Germany." But why did some of these men, trained, indoctrinated, sworn enemies of America, find themselves longing to stay behind barbed wire in a foreign land rather than return to their homeland? The answer lies not in one meal or one kind gesture, but in the accumulation of small, human experiences that shattered propaganda and forced them to see the world with new eyes. And this is where the heart of our story begins. Because when the war ended, the gates of the camps swung open. Trains were waiting. Ships stood ready. For many, it was the moment they had prayed for: freedom. But for others, it was the moment they feared most. The war was over. The Reich had fallen. Hitler was dead. In the summer of 1945, German POW camps in the U.S. buzzed with rumors: repatriation. The word itself was heavy. For months, sometimes years, these men had dreamed of going home. Now, suddenly, the gates would open. But instead of joy, something else spread among certain prisoners: dread. Why? Because for many, America had become more than captivity. It had become a strange, fragile version of peace. To understand this dread, imagine a morning in a POW camp in Texas. The sun rises hot and red over the flat horizon. In the mess hall, men line up for breakfast. They smell coffee, real coffee, not the acorn substitute their families drank in Germany. They hear the sizzle of bacon on the griddle. Metal trays clatter as each man receives eggs, toast, butter. One prisoner closes his eyes and inhales deeply. He thinks of his mother back in Dresden, boiling potatoes in a dim kitchen, praying the ration card stretches one more week. He cannot reconcile the two worlds. After breakfast, he's marched out to a cotton field. The air smells of earth and sweat, but also of blossoms carried by the wind. The work is hard, but when he stumbles, a farmer's son, barely 16, offers him a drink of water. "Here," the boy says in broken German, grinning. The prisoner stares at the canteen, unsure if kindness is allowed. He drinks. These were the kinds of moments that haunted them. The taste of butter. The smell of coffee. The sound of laughter from American children on the other side of the barbed wire. And when word came that it was time to return home, many prisoners realized something painful. They had come to feel safer in captivity than they expected to feel in freedom. Letters and diaries reveal the turmoil. A prisoner in Wisconsin wrote, "I have received word from my family. They live among ruins. My father is gone. My mother writes that she must stand in line for hours for bread. I am ashamed to say this, but here I live better than they. What kind of world is this, where a prisoner eats while the free starve? Another in Texas confided to his diary. I am torn. I want to see my homeland again, the forests of Bavaria, the smell of pine. But I dread what I will find. Hunger, rubble, shame. And here, the farmer's daughter smiled at me when she gave me bread. That smile has unsettled everything I believed. Even guards noticed the hesitation. One American MP recalled years later, "We expected the Germans to cheer when they heard they were going home. But some of them looked like we'd told them a death sentence. They knew what waited for them in Germany. Nothing." Why such dread? Because word had spread of Germany's condition. Cities were flattened. Millions were homeless. Food shortages were catastrophic. Women and children bartered on the black market for scraps. The Allied bombing campaigns had left entire neighborhoods as nothing but ash. And beyond the material loss was something deeper: shame. The men knew what they were returning to, a nation forced to confront its role in a war of aggression, genocide, and collapse. To walk back into Germany was to walk into collective guilt. A POW put it plainly in a letter never sent. "I would rather stay here behind the wire, eating bread in the sun, than walk free in a country that no longer knows what it is." Many of these prisoners had been told America would humiliate them. They expected to be spat on, mocked, or tortured. Instead, they found themselves teaching German to curious farmers' children, playing soccer in fields, or being allowed to borrow library books. The contrast was brutal. One POW recalled, "In Germany, I marched under banners and shouted slogans. Here, I watched two farmers argue over which baseball team was better. They laughed so hard they forgot they were angry. I thought, what kind of people are these, who can laugh even in war?" That laughter stayed with him more than the propaganda ever did. There are countless small stories that explain why some didn't want to leave. In Alabama, a group of POWs working in peanut fields were invited to a Christmas dinner by the farmer's family. They sat around a decorated tree, ate turkey and pie, and sang carols, first in German, then in English. One prisoner later wrote, "I had not seen a Christmas tree since 1939. I cried silently because I felt at home in the house of strangers." In Nebraska, another group was given extra rations of milk by local farmers. They knew the Germans were young boys, really, and wanted them healthy. The POWs never forgot the taste. And in Wisconsin, prisoners who had formed a choir were allowed to perform at a local church. The congregation applauded. Some villagers wept. For the POWs, it was the first time they had been applauded not as soldiers, but as human beings. The prisoners' minds filled with sensory collisions. Sight, barbed wire fencing, but beyond it, children playing with kites in open fields. Sound, the clatter of rifles at roll call, but also the soft hum of jazz music drifting from American radios. Taste, army rations bland but filling, alongside fresh pies or lemonade offered by curious civilians. Smell, dust and sweat from long days in the fields, mixed with the sharp, sweet scent of American tobacco, unlike anything they had smoked at home. These were not just luxuries. They were revelations, proof that another kind of life was possible. A young prisoner named Carl kept a journal. In it he wrote, "At home we were told America was weak, but I have seen their strength is not only in tanks and guns, is in their farms, their families, their freedom to laugh. It makes me wonder, were we the weak ones all along?" Another man, Otto, wrote, "I dread the day I must go back. Here I have work, bread, even books. In Germany there will be rubble and hunger. I think often of staying. But how?" And still another, Hans, reflected, "In captivity, I learned what freedom could be." These writings, fragile and private, survive in archives and personal collections. They paint a picture of men who, through war, stumbled into an accidental education, what it meant to live without fear. Of course, not all prisoners felt this way. Many still clung fiercely to loyalty for the Reich, or simply longed for the forests, rivers, and familiar songs of home. In some camps, hardliners attacked those who grew sympathetic to America. They called them traitors, cowards, weaklings. But no amount of intimidation could erase the quiet truth some had seen. That life, even under the label of enemy prisoner, could sometimes feel freer than life under their own flag. As trains were prepared for repatriation, many prisoners faced a personal crisis. Some dragged their feet, hoping for delays. Others wrote desperate letters to American guards or farmers, asking if there was any way to stay. A few even attempted escape, not to flee captivity, but to avoid leaving America. One farmer remembered, "One of the boys begged me to hide him in the barn. He said, "I will work for you the rest of my life if I don't have to go back." I didn't know what to say. We liked him. But of course, it was impossible. Impossible, yet telling. These were not the pleas of men desperate for freedom. They were the pleas of men desperate not to lose the strange kind of peace they had found. Picture the last day in a camp in 1946. The prisoners line up with their belongings, simple bags, a few books, some souvenirs. They smell the diesel of buses waiting outside. The air is heavy with dust and heat. The guards, many of whom have grown friendly with the men, shake hands. Some embrace. One guard slips a prisoner a small packet of tobacco for the trip. On the bus, silence. A few men stare out the window at the American landscape, wide fields, distant towns, billboards promising products they'll never buy. One man whispers, "Will I ever see this again?" For some, the return to Germany would mean reunion with family. For others, it would mean walking into ruins, hunger, and despair. And for a small but unforgettable number, it would mean leaving behind the only place where they had ever felt truly free. At first glance, it seems strange, even absurd, that enemy soldiers captured in war might hesitate to return home when the fighting ended. But their hesitation reveals something deeper, something that reaches beyond borders and uniforms. War strips people down. It reduces life to hunger, fear, obedience. Propaganda whispers that the enemy is a monster, that you yourself are noble, that everything is clear and simple. But then, small moments arrive. A cold glass of lemonade. A smile from a stranger. The taste of butter when you expected hunger. And suddenly, the world is no longer clear and simple. Suddenly, the enemy is human. What happened in those POW camps was not just about food or comfort. It was about a collision between two ways of living. On one side, Germany, shattered by war, ruled by lies, consumed by ideology. A homeland where obedience was demanded, dissent was crushed, and survival meant sacrifice. On the other, America, imperfect and often suspicious, but bursting with abundance, freedom, and a casual kind of kindness that astonished those raised under authoritarianism. For the POWs, this collision forced a reckoning. Many realized that their enemy's way of life was not only different, but, in some ways, better. It wasn't grand speeches or political lectures that changed them. It was the ordinary. The smell of bread fresh from a farmhouse oven. The sound of music on a summer evening. The simple fact that an American farmer would hand water to a German boy who, months earlier, might have been trying to kill his son overseas. These are the moments that reshaped belief. These are the moments that made some POWs dread going home. One prisoner wrote later, "It was not freedom I learned in America. It was humanity. We were treated not as Nazis, not as enemies, but as men." That was the revelation. That even in war, even inside barbed wire, dignity was possible. When the war ended and repatriation began, the irony was brutal. Freedom meant return to hunger, ruin, shame. Captivity had offered structure, food, and above all, glimpses of kindness. And so some German POWs, faced with going home, felt as though they were being sent into exile. This reversal tells us something profound, that home is not always the place you are born. Sometimes, home is wherever you are treated as human. The story of German POWs in America is not just about the past. It is about the fragile, powerful ways humans encounter one another across lines of hatred. We like to think wars are won by tanks, by bombs, by flags raised over rubble. But sometimes the quiet victories, the ones that last, are won by a plate of food, a song shared, or a hand extended across barbed wire. These POWs returned to Germany, yes, but they carried with them an unshakable memory that the world was larger than they had been told, and that humanity could survive even in enemy hands. Consider what this means. These were young men raised on years of Nazi propaganda. They were trained to see Americans as decadent, weak, dangerous. Yet in their lowest moment, defeated, disarmed, imprisoned, they found not cruelty but decency. That decency cracked something open. It proved that the lines drawn by propaganda were not permanent. That empathy, even in war, could change how a man understood the world. And once that change began, it could not easily be undone. Of course, there was guilt too. Many prisoners carried it silently. They knew what their army had done in Europe. They knew what their families were enduring at home. To be treated kindly in America, while loved ones suffered in ruins, was almost unbearable. But guilt sharpened the contrast. It made every act of kindness, every shared meal, feel like a lesson. A lesson that the Reich had failed them, not just by losing the war, but by blinding them to the possibility of human connection. So what does this story tell us about war? It tells us that even when nations clash in the bloodiest conflict in history, humanity does not vanish. It hides in small places, in kitchens, in fields, in laughter shared across language barriers. It tells us that propaganda may build walls, but a smile, a glass of lemonade, or a shared Christmas carol can quietly dismantle them. And it tells us that sometimes the deepest victories are invisible, when an enemy soldier leaves not hating you more, but questioning everything he thought he knew. Imagine one last scene. A German POW, finally returned to his ruined hometown in 1946, walks among rubble. He smells dust, smoke, rot. He sees hollow-eyed children. He hears silence where once there was music. In his mind, he remembers something different. The sound of American children playing, the smell of coffee at dawn, the taste of pie offered by a farmer's wife. He remembers a kindness that came from the very enemy he was taught to despise. And he thinks, maybe the world can be more than this. Maybe it must be. The story of German POWs who didn't want to go home is not about loyalty or betrayal or weakness. It is about revelation. It is about how, in the most unlikely of places, behind barbed wire, under guard, men discovered that war could not kill the human hunger for dignity, kindness, and hope. And it is about how those small moments, so ordinary and so easily overlooked, can sometimes shift the course of a life. Because sometimes the greatest victories are not written in treaties or carved into stone monuments. Sometimes they are carried quietly, in the memory of a prisoner who once sat at an American table, broke bread with strangers, and saw his enemy not as an enemy at all, but as a fellow human being.